Welcome. As Maureen said, we're here getting ready to start our third week of the You and I Together Spring Series. So I'm super excited to be here and joining all of our wonderful groups and individuals out there. I'm Joey Pites. I'm an extension educator. And I just want to introduce a couple helpers I have with me here today. Maureen Toomey is going to be watching chat for us, and Andrew Bingham is going to be letting people into the Zoom room. So I appreciate all their help. This week, we are going to do bread in a bag. So I just want to share with you that University of Idaho Extension really works hard to bring the knowledge and the research that's happening at the university to you locally, where you live, where you work, where you play, where it's convenient for you to get information and to take workshops in that. We work hard to really build a thriving and healthy Idaho in that. So if you look at this slide, we work on quite a few issues out there. Food production, 4-H youth development, horticulture and gardening, and of course, my favorite, nutrition and health. The next slide's about 30 seconds of a little highlight about nutrition and health.
University of Idaho Extension is keeping Idaho's citizens and communities healthy by helping people of all ages improve their health and build important life skills. From nutrition education, diabetes management, and food safety to family finance education, UI Extension is helping build healthy and thriving Idahoans.
Just a little bit of information about University of Idaho Extension, particularly to health and nutrition. And as I shared, I'm Joey Pites. I'm based in Payette County, so how fun is it to get to see some people who have their cameras on from around the Treasure Valley and even possibly around the state in that. So if you can't guess from the pictures, I'm pretty passionate about food and teaching people to cook and food safety and food preservation. But what I'd really like for you to do is, if you participate in You and I Together, take some snapshots of what you're doing, what your children are doing, what your group is doing. Post those to social media. If you don't want to do that, but you're willing to have your pictures shared, go ahead and send them to Nick Uzabel. I have included his email address there, and Andrew or Maureen can also drop that into the chat so that you have that later on if you'd like to. So what are we going to do today? What are our goals in that? So we're going to talk a little bit about food safety and some of those steps. We're going to talk about the ingredients in bread. We're going to talk a little bit about kneading. And of course, we're going to make a pretzel today. And if we have time, I might talk just a tiny bit about Idaho agriculture and how important it is to us. So here, this next slide coming up, I would love for you to either unmute or type in the chat, or if you've got a helper at your site, you can shout out and they can type it into the chat. But what is the first step when we're cooking? What's the first thing that we should do?
Wash your hands.
Yay! Excellent. Excellent in that. Definitely wash your hands in that. So hopefully if you're joining me at the same time, you wash your hands. I've already washed my hands right before we got started in that. So my next question for all of you, same thing, type in the chat or unmute and shout out. What ingredients do we need to make bread, or in this case, a pretzel? What are the things that go into that?
Salt.
I heard salt, Joey, and I think I heard yeast.
Salt, yeast, excellent. Anything else?
Flour.
Excellent. Flour, I heard that one. That was really clear. So we've got salt, yeast, flour. Anything else?
Water.
Water. You guys did great. There's a couple other ingredients that we're going to use today to make our our pretzel in this. And all of these have a function and reason. This is the science behind bread making. So the flour that you see on there gives us the structure to our bread. It's got some protein and starches in it, but it's kind of that main ingredient we need. We're going to add the most of the ingredient will be flour. Then we have yeast. Yeast is a microorganism that grows, and it's going to help our dough to rise. And we have a tiny bit of sugar. Now, a lot of people say, oh, sugar's for taste. And it is a tiny bit, but really the amount we put in is going to feed our yeast. Our yeast wants to eat, it wants to grow, just like you all need food, that yeast needs food, and it's going to eat that sugar, and then it's going to convert it to carbon dioxide, a gas, and that's what's going to help our dough to rise. Now, our salt really is an important ingredient. We're not going to put very much in, but it is really there for taste. There's also some additional science behind that, and that it helps the gluten bond, but we're not going to get into that today in that. And then you guys also shouted out water. So water is important because it activates the yeast. It makes our dough. And we're going to talk a little bit here in just a bit about why temperature of that water becomes so important. And then the last ingredient we're going to use today is oil in that. So that's what keeps our bread from, helps our bread to be moist and flaky in that. So I just want to touch upon a little bit about that. Bread does fall into my plate, and what you're seeing on the screen is my Idaho plate. Those are all ingredients, those are all products or foods that are grown in Idaho in that. And of course, our bread is going to fit into the grains section of that. I really want to emphasize that we should make half of your grains whole in that. And that means using the whole kernel of whatever grain it is. So if it's wheat, we want to use all of it. Today, our recipe is calling for white flour, so they've taken part of that grain off in that to give us a really light flavored bread in that. But when you have a chance, make half your grains whole. Now, I think we might have some people participating that might have a gluten intolerance. And there are some recipes out there for gluten-free breads. They're going to use a different kind of flour. An example might be potato flour. And they're going to use different things to help make that rise, because the gluten forms the structure of that bread. So it might use some quick leavening things like baking powder or baking soda and buttermilk in that to help make it rise in that. But there are other options out there. So I've been talking for a little while, but I am guessing that you all would love to really get ready for some doughy finger fun and really start making our pretzel in that. So getting ready, I hope that you have printed off or have the recipe in front of you, but our recipe is going to call for 2 cups of all-purpose flour. So we're going to put all of our ingredients into a plastic bag here in that. I'm going to set my plastic bag in a bowl. You don't need to do that, but since I'm here doing this by myself, I just didn't want it to fall over in that. So that's what you're seeing. So I know on another You and I Together, some of our instructors showed you how to measure flour. We're going to use a dry measuring cup. We're just going to level that off. And then we're going to put in our first cup of flour right into our bag. We're going to put our second cup of flour into our bag. Now we're not done with our flour, so I am going to set this off to the side. a little bit. So we're going to add all of our dry ingredients to that. So our second ingredient is our yeast that you guys shouted out in that. It can come into a jar. I'm going to do a jar so it's a little bit easier to measure, or you could have little packets, and we need 1 tablespoon of yeast in that. And it's super easy to get a tablespoon and a teaspoon mixed up when you're cooking, so you want to be really careful and double check that if it says a tablespoon, you're using a tablespoon in that, and not a teaspoon. So here's our yeast that we're putting right into our bag. Then the next thing we need is our sugar in that. And remember, this sugar is just a tiny bit so the yeast has something to eat. And so it calls for 2 teaspoons of sugar. We'll put that right in the bag. And our last dry ingredient that we're going to add is that salt to give our pretzel some good flavor in that. I'm not going to pour the salt right over my bag, because if I mess up and accidentally pour too much, that wouldn't be good. So I'm going to do it off to the side and then dump it in my bag. So we have all of our dry ingredients in that. And one thing I would tell you is that this time I purchased Ziploc bags that have the slider on it, and I actually don't like it. The ones that kind of click actually work just a little bit better in that. So I pushed a little bit of the air out, and I'm just, these dry ingredients, I'm just going to lightly mix those. And then we are going to add, and it'll probably stand up pretty well by itself in that, we are going to add a tablespoon of oil. Kind of the same thing. I'm going to measure over my bowl and not over my bag in case I spill. I double checked that I'm using a tablespoon and not a teaspoon. And if you remember, that oil is to help keep our bread moist.
And Joey, does it matter what kind of oil it is?
That's a great question. So I'm using a vegetable oil in this. You can use an olive oil, but it's going to have a slightly different flavor in that. So depending on what you want, it'll have a little bit different flavor, but you can use other oils in that. All right. So our last wet ingredient is 1 cup of fairly warm water. About 110 degrees water is going to go right into our bag. So why does the temperature of the water matter? It is important because the yeast is going to grow better, grow faster if that water is warm in that. So then once you have your bag, you're going to want to zip it. You saw me zip it, and I kind of push some of the air out of it. And you're going to start mixing it in your bag and that. Now, depending, I've done this with quite a few students before, and sometimes they don't measure the water quite right, and so their dough becomes really, really stiff and dry, and they can't get it mixed in. Kind of let you see that a little bit. Sometimes they add too much water, and if you add too much water, you can add just a touch more flour in that. So within that bag, I'm going to push a little more air out. In that bag, you want to get it all mixed, and sometimes you can, this mixed pretty well, but sometimes in the corner, there can be a little bit of flour that you want to try and work out of those corners in that bag. So this is pretty wet dough right here. And I would add just a touch more flour and keep working that. Make sure you guys can see that. See, it's sticking a lot to the bag in that. So I'd add just a little bit more flour. I am going to grab some that I made about 20 minutes ago in that. You can see it's still a little bit sticky, but not quite as sticky as that other one because I added just a touch more flour. So now here's the fun part. We are, if you've got long sleeves and you're working with me, go ahead and roll up your sleeves. If you've got any jewelry on, be sure and take that off. I have sanitized my surface area in that. I've used bleach water, so a gallon of bleach and 2 tablespoons of, a gallon of water and 2 tablespoons of bleach. But I am going to sprinkle flour right on my sanitized surface in that. And then I'm going to unzip my bag and that. I'm going to kind of get it into as much as a ball I can before I get my hands in that. I'm going to sprinkle just a tiny bit of flour on top. I'm going to get my hands in there. Then I'm going to start working this right out of the bag. And we have dough, and we have some messy hands. Now you actually want to save your bag. You don't want to throw it away yet. You'll see why here in just a minute. Now we are going to start, get your hands with flour, kneading that dough. And when you knead dough, it's recommended that you use this part of your hand and kind of keep your fingers together, and you push out, you kind of fold it over and you push out. And if it kind of gets sticky, you can kind of roll it around in the flour a little bit, put a little bit. You want to use as little flour as possible because it'll give you a little bit softer of a pretzel. You're going to knead for about 5 minutes. So I'm not going to knead the whole time, but I want you to kind of get the idea of kneading. And what kneading does, it's important because it develops the gluten, that protein in the flour, and that's what gives it its structure. So when that yeast gives off that carbon dioxide, it will rise. So if you're following me at home and you've been kneading for 5 minutes, you're actually just going to take that plastic bag and you're going to put it over your dough ball in that. And we are going to let it rest for 10 minutes. Now, I'm not going to let it rest for 10 minutes so that you guys can, or the groups can still see what's happening in that. But I did this one. Go ahead and already do one. So I'm going to move this off and let you see. So this has actually been about 30 minutes. So it's going to be a little bit more doughy, risen a little bit more than it would be if I had just done it 10 minutes ago. So now we're going to put a little more flour down in that. It's not dried out because we had the plastic on it. That's why we put the plastic. We're going to just give it a couple of turns and coat it with flour. And then if you're working with a partner, this is actually quite a bit of dough. You are going to divide your dough in half. And it's just kind of a pinching motion. and that, and then your partner can have one of the balls and you can have one of the balls, or if you're doing this just yourself, you can still divide it up because you probably don't want to have a pretzel the size of a loaf of bread in that. So you can do a couple things. You can make one big pretzel, and that's what I'm going to show you today in that. Or you could pinch it again and make two smaller pretzels out of that. So now we're going to shape our dough. And last week, we have creative fun with clay in that. And you got to roll out your clay. So if you haven't seen that You and I Together video, I'd really encourage you to go out and watch that as well. So Maureen showed people how to roll out their dough. And we're going to roll this into kind of a long rope, about 16 to 18 inches. And if you notice, I'm not going back and forth in that. A lot of times our children want to just roll it back and forth, and that actually makes it pretty tough to get it rolled out. Go in one direction and pushing out and bringing it back towards me, one direction and pulling out. Now I've done a pretty good job of developing the gluten in this dough, and I know that because it pulls back together. It's kind of like rubber bands in there. So it kind of becomes stretchy and it wants to pull back together. So it takes a little to get that rolled out. And try to get it as even as you can. Now this makes a pretty big puffy pretzel. So you can see I have a pretty long rope in this. And now I'm going to shape the pretzel. And to shape your pretzel, all you do is you cross it once, you cross it twice, and then you lay it together. And I'll show you again, just so you have it. So you've got your long rope, both ends, you kind of make a U, you come together, you cross it again, and then you hold both of those ends, and you lay it on your pretzel. All right, now we want to put it on a baking sheet. So here is a baking sheet, and I have lined it with parchment paper. Parchment paper is not waxed paper in that, because our wax paper would melt in the oven. This won't. We're going to lay it on our tray. And if you're baking several individuals, you might want to put their name just on that parchment paper in that. Now you can, if you want a savory pretzel, you can put salt on it. If you want a pretzel that has cinnamon sugar, a sweet pretzel, you can do that as well. So my directions say just to brush it with water, because you'll want whatever it is topping you're going to put on it, you'll want that to stick. I'm going to use just a little bit of vegetable spray, just a little bit on that. And I'm going to make this a sweet pretzel today. And I am going to sprinkle a little bit of just sugar and cinnamon right on that pretzel. And then it's ready to go into a 400-degree oven for 12 to 15 minutes. Now these are pretty big pretzels, and so it might take just a little bit longer to do that. All right, we're just going to wipe up this up just a little bit and show you some finished pretzels. They're pretty big. You can see why you might want to make them a little bit smaller. So Andrew's pretzel had salt sprinkled on it, and Maureen's pretzel had cinnamon and sugar sprinkled on that. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and ask if there are any questions.
Well, Joey, I put the recipe in the chat for those who didn't get it downloaded, the handout downloaded. And I also put to bake at 400 degrees for 12 to 14 minutes, depending on the size of your pretzel. And just clarifying, your oven should already be at 400 degrees when you put the pretzel pan in, correct?
Excellent. Yes, it should already be. So you want to preheat that oven.
What kind of salt do you use
On the pretzel.
on the pencil?
What kind of salt do you sprinkle on the pretzel?
Yeah, I've used kosher salt, which is a little bit bigger salt in that, but actually even a larger grain salt, the larger grain salt is going to be better. So the bigger that little salt unit is in that will be better.
And Joey, could we use some whole wheat in our 2 cups of flour? Could some of that be whole wheat flour?
It can be whole wheat flour. You probably don't want to use all whole wheat because whole wheat, it's really healthy for us. It's going to give us fiber and some other nutrients in that. That's why we want to make half our grains whole. But that whole wheat actually cuts the gluten too, so it won't rise quite as high. So that's why they'll often use half white, half whole wheat. And that. So we have just a couple minutes. So I wanted to ask all of our participants today, let me see if I can get this up. So if you see this, what do you think this is a picture of?
Wheat.
Oh, we got some people saying wheat. What else? Did I hear grass as the first thing? I think I heard grass in that. Most of the students that I work with say that looks pretty much like grass, and it does look like grass. But that product, when it grows and it matures and then it dries out, it becomes wheat in that. And ask you to give us some feedback. We have some great incentives or some prizes that we would like you to do. So if you have your phone handy, you can scan the QR code, or Marie or Andrew will drop that link into our chat box. So I really want to thank all of you for joining us today, and hope if you weren't joining along with me at the same time, that if you're watching this video, you have fun making your bread or your pretzel. You have a couple options with this recipe in that.